6. Naval Intelligence. Published accounts on the organization and operations of the Office of Naval Intelligence and its Marine Corps counterpart during World War II reveal very little about the structure and activities of these units. Generally, the Marine Corps collected and generated its own combat intelligence, while ONI, which included Marines on its staff, had combat intelligence responsibilities for the Navy and strategic intelligence duties for both services. The Office of Naval Intelligence was initially organized on a geographic basis, then a functional scheme, and maintained units in each of the naval districts and principal fleet commands. It supervised naval attachés, naval observers, and liaison officers abroad. The office apparently suffered from a fast turnover of directors during the war years and was handicapped as well by a limited view on the part of the Chief of Naval Operations as to its role. According to one official history assessing the agency, quote, arguments as to the scope of naval intelligence responsibility were frequent. The position taken by CNO during World War II was that OP-16, a Navy acronym identifying ONI, was in effect a post office charged with forwarding intelligence reports and other data to the activity in the Navy Department most likely to need and make use of the information. That OP-16 had neither the time nor the qualified personnel to search for obscure leads in the reports pointing to enemy intentions with respect, for example, to new weapon developments or future operations. The process of evaluating and disseminating the information contained in intelligence reports came in for investigation and some criticism by the Joint Congressional Committee that inquired into the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was brought out during the hearings that the Director of Naval Intelligence had authority to disseminate technical, statistical, and similar information received by his office, but that he had no authority to evaluate certain aspects of military intelligence, such as developing the enemy's intentions, nor to disseminate such information and its evaluation. These were responsibilities of the War Plans Division. The questions asked, the conclusions reached, and the recommendations made by the Joint Congressional Committee indicated the belief that the Director of Naval Intelligence should have had more authority to evaluate and disseminate information of that kind. The naval authorities held, however, that the responsibility for developing enemy intentions from information gathered and analyzed by the intelligence service and its dissemination must be left to the individual in the organization of the CNO responsible for war planning. It was in general held by the Navy Department that even the war plans officer could not be the final arbiter in some cases. The Chief of Naval Operations, the Secretary of the Navy, and even the President might have to make the final decision. A measure of the pressing need for military intelligence in modern warfare was the increase in personnel employed on such work in CNO and in the field during World War II. In June 1938, about 60 officers and some 100 enlisted personnel and civilians were employed in the Naval Intelligence Division, OP-16. On 1st of July 1945, the numbers stood at 543 officers, 675 enlisted personnel, and 330 civilians. The increase in the field was even greater. At Pearl Harbor, the Naval Intelligence Unit at the time of the attack consisted of a few officers and enlisted personnel. At the peak during the war, some 4,500 people were engaged on such work at Pearl Harbor. End quote. Footnote: Julius Augustus Furrer, Administration of the Navy Department in World War II. Washington, U.S. Government Print Office, 1959, pages 119 and 120. End footnote. Special activities developed by the Office of Naval Intelligence during the war seemed to be security investigation, intelligence training, and psychological warfare. Quote, 3 months before war broke out again in Europe in 1939, President Roosevelt issued an executive memorandum recognizing the Security Division as a functioning entity of ONI responsible for investigating espionage, counterespionage, and sabotage. Just as ONI's undercover agents were the first American investigators into Latin America in search of German spies before this country entered World War I, the ONI was the first to deal with Japanese espionage before the FBI took over in World War II. At that time, the Navy was the only American agency with any degree of knowledge about Japan. From the beginning of World War II, the rapidly expanding corps of investigators literally covered the waterfront. They checked on the backgrounds of naval civilian personnel in jobs involving the national security, investigated suspected cases of espionage and subversive activities, guarded against sabotage, uncovered fraud in the buying or selling of naval materials, traced security leaks, and did the Navy's detective work on crime. Security was their mission, and protecting the naval establishment their goal. Not all threats to security, they found, need to be related directly to enemy efforts. End quote. Footnote: Miriam Ottenberg, The Federal Investigators, Englewood Cliffs, Prentice Hall, 1962, page 64. End footnote. Development of the intelligence training organization and function must be credited to then, 1942, Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence Ellis M. Zacharias, who later wrote, quote, "Training of personnel was our primary problem, since we had only an inadequate intelligence school chiefly concerned with the preparation of officers for investigation duties, known as gumshoe activities among those in a belittling mood. Complaints heard in the field offices decided me to make training my number one project. Radical changes had to be made, and I took it upon myself to make them immediately. The old school was abolished, and 2 new schools were created. One in Frederick, Maryland, called the Basic Intelligence School, to introduce newcomers to the elementary principles and techniques of intelligence, and another, the Advanced Intelligence School in New York, to train intelligence officers on an operational level. This second school grew out of the realization that naval intelligence in war has somewhat different tasks from those of Army intelligence. The elements of ground combat and the problems which it raises are largely non-existent in naval warfare, so that what the Army calls its combat intelligence has but limited application in the Navy. What we needed was operational intelligence, an activity between strategy and tactics, providing in intelligence everything a commander might need to take his ships into combat or to conduct amphibious warfare. The immense mobility of fleets and the wide expanse of our watery battlefield necessitated a broadening of intelligence work, too, and we felt that our operational intelligence would take all these factors into consideration. We planned to train hundreds of operational intelligence officers by driving them through a hard curriculum compressed into a comparatively short time. We actually trained 1,000, and as I now look back upon this project and the demands which soon poured in upon us, I feel that we were not disappointed in our expectations. My faith in Lieutenant, now Commander, John Mathis, USNR, who headed this school, was well-founded. His legal mind, pleasant personality, and keen investigative abilities gave me confidence. Ably assisted by an outstanding faculty of men high in the educational field, such as Lieutenant Richard W. Hatch, Lieutenant Garrett Mattingly, and others, the success of this undertaking was assured. End quote. Footnote: Ellis M. Zacharias, Secret Missions, The Story of an Intelligence Officer, New York, G. P. Putnam's Sons, 1946, pages 296 through 297. End footnote. It was also in 1942 that ONI embarked upon its psychological warfare effort, the first undertaking being a carefully programmed propaganda barrage designed to demoralize the German Navy. This was followed by similar campaigns against the Italian Navy and the Japanese. Always operating in extreme secrecy, the new unit made its initial broadcast on January 8, 1943. Quote, The establishment of what we called the Special Warfare Branch, we feared that calling it Psychological Warfare Branch, we should engender even greater hostility by opponents of everything psychological, was greeted with extreme enthusiasm by the Office of War Information, which then found cooperation with the armed forces a very difficult task. Elmer Davis, director of OWI, became our champion, and whenever attempts were made to abolish our branch, he pleaded with our highest echelons and borrowed time for us so that we could continue our activities. We worked in the closest and most harmonious cooperation with OWI, which was the sole vehicle for the dissemination of our material. The broadcast recordings were prepared for OWI in a studio of the Interior Department, then under the able direction of Shannon Allen, and manned with capable technicians. The broadcasts were put on the air by OWI 7 times a day, 3 days a week, from all outlets OWI then had in the United States, North Africa, and Great Britain. In addition, we prepared for them a program called Prisoner of War Mail, an arrangement by which German and Italian prisoners kept in this country could send greetings to their relatives and friends in their homelands. This was the first such attempt made in the United States, and it yielded splendid propaganda results. We also worked with OWI in drawing up propaganda directives insofar as naval warfare was concerned, and this close cooperation proved that a military and civilian agency could work together smoothly on what was undoubtedly an important military operation." End quote. Cryptanalysis operations were administered by the Office of Naval Communications, and the information derived from these activities was shared with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Created in 1912 as the Naval Radio Service of the Bureau of Navigation, Naval Communications was attached to the newly created Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in 1915 as a co-equal unit with ONI, and was named the Communications Division some 4 years later. In the twilight before American entry into the war, an effort was made, in May of 1941, to create a special communications intelligence monitoring capacity for the Pacific region. Quote, "In the middle of that month, the U.S. Navy took an important step in the radio intelligence field. It detached a 43-year-old lieutenant commander from his intelligence berth aboard USS Indianapolis and assigned him to reorganize and strengthen the radio intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor. The officer was Joseph John Rochefort, the only man in the Navy with expertise in 3 closely related and urgently needed fields: cryptanalysis, radio, and the Japanese language. Rochefort, who had begun his career as an enlisted man, had headed the Navy's cryptographic section from 1925 to 1927. 2 years later, a married man with a child, he was sent, because of his outstanding abilities, as a language student to Japan, a hard post to which ordinarily only bachelor officers were sent. This 3-year tour was followed by half a year in naval intelligence. Most of the next 8 years were spent at sea. Finally, in June of 1941, Rochefort took over the command of what was then known as the radio unit of the 14th Naval District in Hawaii. To disguise its functions, he renamed it the Combat Intelligence Unit. His mission was to find out, through communications intelligence, as much as possible about the dispositions and operations of the Japanese Navy. To this end, he was to cryptanalyze all minor and one of the 2 major Japanese naval cryptosystems." End quote. Subsequently, the director of ONI was given an indirect role in the operations of this unit by simultaneously holding the position of Assistant Chief of Staff for Combat Intelligence in the headquarters of Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, in charge of the Combat Intelligence Division. As with all other intelligence agencies, CID began to grow after the United States entered the war and struggled with the challenges of 1942. Quote, "By the next year, it had changed its name to Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific Fleet, FRUPAC, in the Navy's interminable list of acronyms. Rochefort had departed in October 1942 for 2 years of non-cryptologic duties. He was replaced by Captain William B. Goggins, 44, a 1919 Annapolis graduate with long list communications experience. Goggins, who had been wounded in the Battle of the Java Sea, remained as head of FRUPAC to January 1945. Lieutenant Commander Thomas H. Dyer continued to head cryptanalysis. Eventually, FRUPAC comprised a personnel of more than 1,000. Much of the work was done in the new Joint Intelligence Center, housed in a long, narrow building across Midway Drive from Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's headquarters, perched atop a cliff overlooking Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Rudolph J. Fabian in Melbourne directed a field unit similar to FRUPAC. He was on the staff of the Commander-in-Chief, 7th Fleet, which was attached to MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command. FRUPAC's growth mirrored that of all American cryptanalytic agencies. This expansion compelled Op-20G, a Navy acronym identifying the agency, to reorganize as early as February 1942. The workload had become too heavy for one man, Commander Lawrence F. Safford. The unit was split up into sections for its 3 major cryptologic functions. 1. The development, production, and distribution of naval cryptosystems, headed by Safford. 2. Policing of American naval communications to correct and prevent security violations. 3. Cryptanalysis, headed by Commander John Redman. In September, the development function was separated from the production. Safford retained control of the development work until the end of the war, devising such new devices as call-sign cipher machines, adapters for British and other cryptographic devices, and offline equipment for automatic operation. About June, the Navy ceded Japanese diplomatic solutions to the Army, giving over its files as well as its purple machine. End quote. While FRUPAC dealt with Japanese codes, only Washington, Naval Communications Headquarters, processed foreign diplomatic systems and naval ciphers used in the Atlantic theater, these being primarily German. Quote, the Navy's official designation of Op-20G indicated that the agency was the G section of the 20th Division of OPNAV, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, the Navy's headquarters establishment. The 20th Division was the Office of Naval Communications, and the G section was the Communications Security section. This carefully chosen name masked its cryptanalytic activities, though its duties did include U.S. Navy cryptography. Its chief was Commander Lawrence F. Safford, 48, a tall, blond Annapolis graduate who was the Navy's chief expert in cryptology. In January 1934, he had become the officer in charge of the newly created research desk in the Navy's Code and Signal section. Here, he founded the Navy's Communication Intelligence Organization. After sea duty from 1926 to 1929, he returned to cryptologic activities for 3 more years, when sea duty was again made necessary by the Manchu laws, which required officers of the Army and Navy to serve in the field or at sea to win promotion. He took command of Op-20G in 1936. One of his principal accomplishments before the outbreak of war was the establishment of the Mid-Pacific Strategic Direction Finder net, and of a similar net for the Atlantic, where it was to play a role of immense importance in the Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boats. Safford's organization enjoyed broad cryptologic functions. It printed new editions of codes and ciphers and distributed them, and contracted with manufacturers for cipher machines. It developed new systems for the Navy. It comprehended such subsections as GI, which wrote reports based on radio intelligence from the field units, and GL, a record-keeping and historical research group. But its main interest centered on cryptanalysis. End quote. Both Navy intelligence and naval communications persisted as major agencies within the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in the aftermath of World War II. It would appear that in 1972, cryptologic duties were transferred from the Naval Communications Command to the Naval Security Group Command, an entity created in 1970 to manage certain internal physical and operational security matters. In 1973, the Naval Communications Command became known as the Naval Telecommunications Command. The old Office of Naval Intelligence is currently called the Naval Intelligence Command. This is Our Hidden History.